What if the only way to save a city was to destroy the entire country that kept it alive? What if the single bravest thing a desperate people ever did was to open the gates and let the oceans swallow their own farms, their own homes, and their own future? Imagine a city where the people are boiling the leather from their own shoes just to have something to chew on. Imagine families stirring a thin, bitter soup made from weeds pulled straight out of the canal, spooning it into the mouths of children who no longer have the strength to cry. Imagine 6,000 people already dead, their bodies stacked in the courtyards of the churches, because no one left alive has the strength to dig another grave. Now, imagine that the people trying to rescue this dying city come up with a plan so extreme, so reckless, that even their own allies are convinced they have completely lost their minds. The plan is to destroy their own homeland, to tear open the mighty dikes that hold back the North Sea, and to deliberately flood thousands of acres of farmland, villages, and roads, turning an entire stretch of countryside into a shallow inland sea, all so that a fleet of tiny boats can sail across what used to be wheat fields and cattle pastures. I have spent years studying military history, and I can tell you, with complete honesty, that this is one of the boldest and strangest gambles ever attempted by any people, anywhere. And here is the part that gives me chills every single time. This actually happened. It happened in the year 1574. And to understand how human beings could ever grow desperate enough to drown their own country, you have to come back with me into one of the darkest corners of European history. Before we go any further into this story, let me take just a moment to welcome you. If you love true stories from history, the kind that sound almost too incredible to be real, then you are exactly in the right place. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Do me one small favor before we continue. Take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every single week I bring you another forgotten story like this one, and I would hate for you to miss what comes next. Now, let us step back into the year 1572, and into a world ruled by fear. At that time, the provinces of the Netherlands rose up in open rebellion against the King of Spain, who happened to be the most powerful ruler on the entire planet. This was no small enemy. The king commanded the largest empire in the world, and his army in this region alone would eventually swell to somewhere around 67,000 soldiers, making it one of the best trained, best funded, and most feared fighting forces in all of Europe. To crush the uprising, the king sent one of his most ruthless commanders into the Netherlands with a single, chilling mission: destroy the revolt and make examples of anyone who dared to resist. And that is exactly what he did. When one town resisted, Spanish soldiers slaughtered nearly the entire population, men, women, and children alike, and left the bodies lying in the streets as a warning to everyone watching. When another city finally fell after a brutal 7-month siege, the entire garrison of around 2,000 soldiers was executed. Some were drowned. Some were beheaded. Some were simply cut down where they stood. The message could not have been clearer. Resist, and you will die. But here is where the story takes a turn that the Spanish never saw coming. Instead of frightening the Dutch into surrender, all of this cruelty had the exact opposite effect. Cities that might have quietly given up suddenly realized a terrible truth. They were going to be slaughtered no matter what they did. One town had barely put up a fight, and its people were massacred anyway. So the choice was no longer between fighting and peace. The choice was between fighting and certain death. And when those are your only two options, something remarkable happens inside the human heart. City after city dug in, strengthened their walls, and declared their loyalty to the nobleman who was leading the rebellion. If they were going to die regardless, they decided they might as well die standing on their feet. One of those defiant cities was a prosperous textile town of roughly 15,000 people, sitting in a position so strategically important that its fate would decide the fate of the entire revolution. It was the last real barrier standing between the Spanish army and the beating heart of the rebellion. If this one city fell, the whole southern flank of the uprising would collapse, and the dream of Dutch freedom could die right along with it. The Spanish knew this. And so, They came to take it. But how could a starving city, with no great army and no powerful weapons, possibly hope to defeat the mightiest empire on earth? The answer, as you are about to discover, lay in something so unexpected, so completely against every rule of warfare, that it still stuns historians to this very day. The Spanish commander surrounded the city in October of 1573, but he chose not to storm the walls. Instead, he settled in for something far more patient and far more cruel. He decided to starve the city into surrender. And here is a detail that most people never learn. The Dutch soil around the city was so soft and so waterlogged that the Spanish soldiers could not even dig proper trenches. The very ground itself seemed to be fighting against the invaders. But time, unfortunately, was on the side of the attackers. Now, there was a brief moment when fate offered the city a lifeline. The siege paused for a short while, and during that pause, the leader of the rebellion sent an urgent warning to the people inside. Restock your food. Bring in more soldiers. Prepare for what is coming. But the city, believing the worst was already behind them, ignored that warning completely. So when the Spanish army returned on the 26th of May, 1574, and locked the city down with 62 fortified positions, the people had almost nothing left. They had food for perhaps 2 months, if they rationed every single crumb, and there were 15,000 hungry mouths to feed. Think about what that truly means. By late July, the bread was gone. By August, the people were slaughtering their horses, then their dogs, then their cats, and finally, the rats in the streets. They boiled tree bark. They scraped moss off the stone bridges. They chewed on the leather of their own shoes and belts, desperate for even a few calories. And because the beer had run dry weeks earlier, and beer had been the only safe thing to drink, they were now forced to swallow filthy canal water that they knew was making them sicker with every sip. Disease swept through the weakened city like wildfire, and soon plague and dysentery were killing people faster than hunger ever could. And yet, in the middle of all this darkness, there is a strange and haunting human story that most tellings leave out entirely. There was a Dutch woman whose family lived inside the besieged city, and she happened to be loved by the Spanish commander himself, a man some 30 years older than she was. According to the legend, she made him a promise. She would marry him, if only he would hold back his attack a little longer, and he agreed. Now, many serious historians believe this romantic tale was invented later, to explain why the city was never actually stormed. But true or not, it reminds us of something we too often forget. Even in the coldest sieges, human hearts were still beating, still hoping, still loving, on both sides of the wall. Back inside the city, the suffering finally reached a breaking point. By early September, a crowd of starving citizens gathered outside the town hall and begged their leaders to surrender. They simply could not endure another day. And this is when the mayor did something that would echo through the centuries. He stepped out to face that desperate, furious crowd, and he told them plainly that the city would never surrender. If they were truly that hungry, he said, then they could take his own body and eat it, but the gates would stay closed. Some accounts say he drew his sword and offered it to them, daring anyone to strike him down. The crowd, stunned into silence, slowly melted away. But hold that image of the heroic mayor in your mind, my friend, because about 30 years from now, in this very story, that legend is going to take a twist that almost no one ever hears about. And I promise you, I will come back to it before we are done. While the mayor was holding his city together by sheer force of will, the leader of the rebellion was outside those walls, quietly working on the most radical military plan anyone had ever imagined. He understood something with brutal clarity. He could never defeat the Spanish army in an open battle. His forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched in every conventional way. His own brother's army had already been crushed and scattered. There was simply no ordinary military solution to this problem. But this man was no ordinary leader. And he understood something about his homeland that the Spanish never fully grasped. This was a country that lived below the level of the sea. The only thing keeping the North Sea from swallowing the whole province was an intricate web of dikes and drainage canals that the Dutch had been building and guarding for centuries. And in that moment of desperation, he realized those dikes were not just walls of earth. They were, quite possibly, the most devastating weapon in the entire Dutch arsenal. His plan was terrifyingly simple. Break the dikes. Let the ocean pour in. Flood the entire countryside between the coast and the city, and then float a fleet of flat-bottomed boats right across the drowned farmland, carrying food and soldiers straight to the city's gates. But there was a heartbreaking cost to this idea. The families who lived in that countryside had spent their whole lives building those very dikes. The salt water would poison their fields for years to come. And so, understandably, many of them resisted, and some even tried to repair the breaches as fast as they were made. In the end, the prince overruled them all, because the stakes were simply too high. If the city fell, the revolution would die, and then none of those farms would matter anyway. To keep hope alive inside the walls, the rebels used carrier pigeons to carry messages back and forth. The man who tended those birds would later be honored with a special surname and a gold medal for his service, because in those desperate months, those tiny pigeons were one of the only threads connecting the dying city to the outside world. Meanwhile, an admiral was assembling the rescue fleet, gathering more than 200 small, flat-bottomed vessels, crewed by 2,500 hardened Dutch sailors. Many of them were the sea beggars, rough and fearless fighters who had been waging a guerrilla war against Spain for years. Their boats were perfect for this impossible mission, because they needed only a foot or so of water to float. And then, on the 3rd of August, 1574, the outer dikes were broken, and the sea began to creep inland. But almost immediately, everything went wrong. The wind blew stubbornly from the east, pushing the water back out instead of driving it in. Instead of a rushing flood, the rebels got a frustrating trickle, leaving the fields barely ankle-deep in most places, far too shallow for the boats to sail. And as if fate itself were mocking them, the prince suddenly collapsed with a violent fever, and the entire rescue ground to a halt. Now, here is where I want to share something with you that the old storytellers almost always miss. That great storm that was coming, the one that would change everything, was not simply a stroke of lucky weather. This siege took place during a period that climate scientists now call the Grindelwald fluctuation. It was a colder chapter of the Little Ice Age, when temperatures across the region dropped by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius or a few degrees Fahrenheit below the modern average, and it lasted from the 1560s all the way into the 1630s. That deep chill scrambled the patterns of the atmosphere, and it funneled far more powerful storms directly toward the Dutch coast. So was the miracle about to unfold an act of God, or was it the hidden hand of a changing climate? Perhaps, my friend, it was quietly both. And as you are about to see, when that climate finally struck, it struck with a fury no army on earth could withstand. For weeks, the fleet sat stranded in shallow water, so close to the city that the trapped people could actually hear the boom of the rescue cannons, and yet the boats simply could not reach them. And then, on the 1st of October, the sky finally broke open. A massive storm roared in from the west, hammering the land with heavy rain and driving the North Sea straight through every gap in the shattered dikes. The shallow puddles that had trapped the fleet for 2 long months suddenly swelled into a surging inland sea, flooding the fields, swallowing the roads, and drowning the low-lying Spanish positions where the soldiers stood. For the Spanish, this was a catastrophe beyond anything they had trained for. The trenches they had dug filled with freezing salt water. Their gunpowder turned to useless sludge. Their supply lines simply vanished beneath the rising tide. The commander could not comprehend it. The idea that a people would deliberately drown their own country, ruining years of harvests just to break a siege, defied every rule of warfare he had ever known. And so, on the night of the 2nd of October, with the water climbing around his men and the rebel ships now floating freely toward him, he gave the only order left to give. Retreat! And when the last soldiers in the final fort saw the water still rising and the enemy ships closing in, they abandoned their posts and fled into the darkness without waiting for permission. On the morning of the 3rd of October, 1574, the rescue ships finally sailed into the city. Now picture this scene with me. A city of walking skeletons, people who had been slowly dying for months, suddenly seeing boats appear across the flooded fields, boats piled high with barrels of herring and baskets of fresh white bread. Grown men and women fell to their knees and wept as they ate. The church bells rang out across the rooftops. And in the abandoned Spanish camp, a young orphan boy discovered a great kettle of stew, still warm, left behind by soldiers who had fled for their lives. But here is a painful truth that almost no one ever tells you. In the joy of that rescue, some of the survivors ate too much, too fast, after starving for so long, and their weakened bodies simply could not handle it. A number of them actually died in the very hours of their salvation. Today, we understand this as refeeding syndrome, but back then it must have seemed like the cruelest twist of all, to survive the famine, only to be taken by the feast. As a reward for the city's unbreakable courage, the prince offered its people a choice. They could have a break from their taxes, or they could have a university, and they chose the university. That school, founded just 4 months later, in February of 1575, would go on to become one of the most respected centers of learning in all of Europe. A city that had nearly starved to death chose knowledge as its reward and became a beacon of light for centuries to come. And now, as I promised, let me return to that heroic mayor, because here is the twist that history quietly buried. Modern researchers have discovered that this very mayor was later removed from his position by the leader of the rebellion himself, apparently for simply not being very good at his job. And yet, in that city, he is still honored as a great hero to this day. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. History does not only record the truth. Sometimes, it creates the heroes that people need to believe in. The Dutch did not flood their homeland because they wanted to. They did it because the only other choice was to vanish from the earth. And it teaches us something timeless. Sometimes, the only way to save everything you love is to be willing to sacrifice something precious in the process. If this story moved you even half as much as it moves me, do leave a comment and tell me which moment struck you the hardest. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next week with another story history nearly forgot.